Hi, friends. Welcome back to The Intimate Philosopher. So, we're going to bring you part two today of our reaction to the Inside the Manosphere documentary because, oh my gosh, there is so much. And we didn't even get to scratch the surface, I don't feel like. Welcome to The Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So, grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. So, we're back and we're going to continue part two.
Yeah.
Okay. So, one of the things that we didn't really do last time was really tying this into the existential givens, right? Of meaning and meaninglessness, being and non-being, isolation and connection, freedom and responsibility. We did talk about that one. And then identity and groundlessness. And so,
W What stuck out for me, I think the thing that immediately when you said that is I think where I ended last time was this identity versus groundlessness, right? Like, Louis shows up and is very clear about who he is, and, I mean, again, we are assuming so many things about all of these people, right? We're getting a very limited 90-minute window into some specific interactions, but at least what is portrayed is that Louis is very comfortable in who he is. He just shows up and he's asking questions and he's very calm and collected the whole time, right? Like he never really even reacts. He's just like, what about this? What about that?
mhm.
Um, and you just get the sense that like he knows who he is. And I think that would match our experience that in general, folks in midlife or having gone through midlife, it's hard to tell exactly how old he is, but they kind of have a sense of who they are. And, he's done this work for a long time. You get the sense that, like, he's very comfortable.
Mhm.
And in contrast, the men that he's interviewing, they just exude groundlessness.
Mhm.
Whether they're the targeted audience of the Manosphere creators or even the creators themselves, like, you can just feel that they're searching for meaning, they're searching for identity, they're searching for the ground. They want to belong to something.
Yeah. Well, this is so interesting because when you exist online, right? When you exist in this influencer sphere, I mean, one of the things that they weren't even believing half the stuff that they were saying online, I feel like. I mean, who knows? But some of it they were saying, "Oh, well, that's just being inflammatory for the clicks or for this or for that." And so there's this idea of feeding the algorithm, like feeding the machine. And, how can you can't have an integrated and aligned self-identity if you're trying to show up and please, the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time possible, right? Like, and I thought that was really interesting because they have this power and they have this influence in some ways. And then in other ways, they are at the mercy of whoever is gonna show up for them because that's how they're making their living. They are and it kind of was like, "Oh, you're the puppet, actually." And that
Um,
was really interesting.
I hadn't thought about that. What strikes me in this moment is thinking about, in particular, in Justin's case, uh, Justin Waller, he's one of the Manosphere content creators. This interaction where these two young men come up to him in the coffee shop and they're like, "Oh, you're our big role model." And you get this impression, and I said this in the first episode, that like he wants to be there for them, right? Like that interaction appears to be genuine. And maybe, like, he knows he's being filmed and he's trying to be genuine, but it didn't feel that way, right? So much of the rest of the documentary, you can tell, like, when people are not being genuine. It felt genuine. And so it makes me think about what you just said, that, like, he's actually waiting for somebody to give him meaning. Those 2 young men give his work meaning.
Mhm.
Like, he needs them to have any meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting. That's so interesting to kind of think about it. And he's a tough one for me because I think in some ways he reminds me probably the most of some of the men that I've worked with who have a lot of talent and they are smart and capable in so many different ways. And then, but he's also like friends with Andrew Tate, right? Who is like a terrible human who has trafficked human beings, And so it's such a challenge to force yourself to remember that people aren't flat two-dimensional characters, right? Like, I it is becoming increasingly challenging for me. I don't believe that people are bad. I really do believe that people are inherently good and that we are capable of doing bad things, but that is not our true nature. And wow, that has been in 2025 and 2026, I feel like I have struggled to hold that belief as true still, more than I have in the past. But like, oh gosh, he bothers me so much because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to do nuance, right? Like, we've talked about this over and over again, and I think it's inherent to the work that you do as a psychotherapist and inherent to this podcast being existential in nature, that there is no just identity or just groundlessness, right? We all experience the range of those things throughout our life,
Mhm.
right? Like, I heard somebody say once that we are all only ever temporarily able bodied,
Mm.
right? That at some point we will all be disabled. And I think that's just, it's really hard to acknowledge nuance until, like, you've walked all of the sides of all of the things. And it's hard to talk about that and to say, like, yeah, like, this guy does matter to those young men. And,
Mhm.
like, which really leads into what you talked a little bit about last time, this, if that is true, that you matter to these people, you can say whatever you want. But what's your responsibility to do good in the world?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and, what's interesting about that is, like, in some ways, having that nuanced conversation when he's addressing these young men and saying, "I love you and you can do whatever you want," that actually doesn't have to kind of, segue into punching down on other people, right? Like, it could actually be just that itself or, like true mentorship and like uplifting and so good. But that doesn't get clicks and
It
that doesn't
doesn't.
get likes, right? And the spectacle, like we are wired into the algorithm now, right, with our phones. And there's a lot of content coming out right now in the news about the Meta and YouTube lawsuit that was just filed
Yeah.
or not filed. I guess they lost and the judge ruled against them because the algorithms are made to be addictive and, show us things that are going to elicit a strong reaction to keep us going. Well, most of that is negative.
Right.
Most of that is negative. I just heard something on I was watching a YouTube video and they said that on your Instagram algorithm, about 7% is friends and family now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's why we have that. I think, at least in the beginning, right? That's why we had Facebook, was just to stay in touch with people you don't see as often.
Yeah.
That's
7%.
wild. As you talk about this, one of the things that I'm remembering is you had a friend tell you back when you started this podcast that you needed to say more inflammatory things, or you needed to just be like, "This is the thing." And I remember you coming home and telling me about that and being like, "I'm not ever gonna do that. I am going to hold the nuance in this show because that is who I am and that is what I believe in the world, even if it doesn't get clicks."
Mhm. No, it's so true. I mean, I can't do that because I won't do it.
Right?
If I try to do this in a different way, I just won't do it. There's so many things that are pulling me in so many different directions that everything that I do these days has to be aligned because otherwise I simply won't do it. I want to pause here for a second and tell you about a tool that I genuinely use every single week, and I paid for it myself. I've used it for about the last 6 months, and this is the planner from Nine to Kind. As you know, our brains are designed to prioritize threat detection over everything else, right? So maybe you didn't know that, but it's true. And the truth is also that right now our brains are having to process a lot of information, so much so that it's actually overwhelming our working memory. So if you find yourself feeling less, oh, I don't know, like on point or forgetting random things, it's not really you. Okay. And at the same time, you still have to figure out how to function within it. So I think it's great when I see other people doing like the aesthetic bullet journaling, but I'm not doing that. So I had to find something else. And one of the things I love about this planner is that it actually combines real structure with emotional regulation because it was designed by an actual therapist. And, there's DBT informed prompts, there's space to track how you're actually doing. And this feature actually mattered more than I expected. There are built in notebook pages right inside each week. So my thoughts and my meetings stay where they belong. And my ADHD brain really appreciates that one. So no more juggling multiple notebooks. That in and of itself is worth checking out. You can use code EMMA20 for 20% off. And if you're like me, a GSD woman who wants to take care of herself without turning self care into yet another project, this one actually works for me. And I think you'll love it. And it helps support the show. So go to 9tokind.com and remember, use code EMMA20 for 20% off your order. Okay, back to the show. So one of the things that they were talking about on this documentary, and something that actually I have run across with my couples, is this idea of, they called it one-way monogamy or one-way polyamory, and it's where one partner is monogamous or expected to be monogamous, and the other person is allowed to be open and have different romantic or sexual relationships with other people. And in this documentary, it was the women are supposed to be monogamous or expected to be monogamous, and the men are, I guess, allowed, or they allow themselves to have multiple partners and to be polyamorous.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to say at the outset of this that like monopoly relationships by choice are very different than what is presented here, where it's very coercive and you will do this. This is a condition of our relationship, is that you will abide by my standards of, purity or chastity or whatever, but I will not. Right? Like those
Mhm.
are two different things. And I think it's just important to say that at the outset.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it was so interesting too to think that, there was this demand on monogamy, and, we've had the conversation of like, what is monogamy? Right.
Haven't we?
Right. And because we were raised very differently when it
We were.
comes to that, and I was rolling it around in my head when I'm watching this. I'm like, oh, I bet that my definition of monogamy wouldn't be suitable to these guys.
I don't think so.
Right. For anybody who doesn't know, so, I was raised with this, don't have sex with other people. If you're in a monogamous relationship, like, don't have sex with other people.
And
And
that's the only boundary.
yes, I mean, I will say that somebody was like, well, does oral sex count? Well, yes, because that would be under the umbrella of sex, right? But they never actually defined what monogamy was. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, but like you didn't get the impression that the women in those relationships were allowed to have conversations with other men. My suspicion is that the expectation of monogamy in all of those relationships was very strict, to
Mhm.
the point of you won't converse with other men without my explicit approval.
Yeah. Gosh, I could never do that. I w my I mean, I'm just sitting here and I'm like, I I would tell those guys to fuck off so fast.
Yes, truth.
Like, under no circumstances, under no circumstances. I mean, I joke and I have ever teased my mom, like, "Mom, I ended up a lesbian because you didn't raise me to be a suitable wife for a man." Right? And this is obviously, like, the most extreme version, like, I don't think that I have never been around real life men who are like this.
Yeah,
My uncles and even my, like, male cousins are all, like, really pretty egalitarian
yeah,
guys, but I'm still like, "Oh my gosh, these guys, there there is no amount of money in the world, there is no amount of clout, there is no amount of swagger that would have me keeping my mouth shut long enough for me to be attractive to you." Like,
oh, that's true. That's true.
yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, and I haven't talked to any of my friends who are poly practitioners, like, in their personal lives as well as, like, whether or not they work professionally. But I'm really curious if the poly world will push back against what these guys were talking about in terms of, like, one-sided monogamy, because I can't imagine that they're good partners in any of their other relationships either.
Well, I think I have to imagine that the poly community would push back, and I think that's actually part of what I was saying at the beginning is that there is a difference between something that is actually consensual and actually agreed upon and something that is coercive. And some people are truly monogamous and some people are not, and it is possible for those people to be in relationship with each other. But like that requires enormous amount of work and vulnerability and talking to manage the feelings and the expectations and like what does that look like? And that's not what was happening here, right? This is, in the same way that we say that that rape isn't about sex and pleasure, rape is about power. This is also about power and control, right? Like this isn't about somebody being polyamorous and loving multiple people or whatever. This is about maintaining power and control over your intimate partner.
Mhm.
At
Yeah.
least that's how it reads to me. I mean, I'm not a psychotherapist, but that is how it reads to me is that this is all about power and control.
Yeah, I can see that. In fact, actually, now that I'm thinking back, I don't even know if they use the term poly. I think they just call it one-way monogamy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'm talking about what you have to do.
Yeah, and I can do whatever I want.
Yes.
Mm.
And our silence, you're like, wow, that's sit with that for a minute.
I'm
Well, one of the things that I think came up as we talked about this was what, like, why or how would this happen? If you don't just assume that it's purely based in misogyny and power or whatever, if you think about kind of everything we talked about last time, where if you're coming from a position of, economic insecurity, of identity insecurity, if you didn't have a loving, close relationship with one or both parents, if like, if there are all of these other things where, um, like, for lack of better terms, like, you have been wanting your whole life, right? Because you haven't been held, you haven't been cared for, in a way that is secure or is steady or is safe. How does that play into what feels in some ways like a trauma response in this case, like, um and maybe that's not the right words. Again, I'm not a psychotherapist, but well, maybe I'll just let you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that you're like, "Well, if we could just, like, set aside the misogyny." I think what you're talking about, I don't know if it's trauma, but it's definitely an attachment wound,
Mm. Yeah,
right?
this is why
And
I'm
this
letting you talk about it.
and there's this idea that, what I saw was somebody who is deeply insecure in their relationship and saying, I need hard, fast ground rules set up in a certain way that you lose something significant like your home or your ability to take care of yourself or something like that. Because a lot of these women didn't have jobs anymore, right? And they had kids. And so we're going to set this up in such a way that I I am attempting to feel safe in my relationship with you by setting up the container so that it is really difficult for you to leave. Not impossible, but very difficult.
Yeah.
And then, as an insurance against being alone or finding myself undesirable, I'm going to have all of these other women that are having sex with me and reinforcing my desirability. And it was really interesting because one of the girls who was the partner of one of the guys, I don't remember which one, had said, well, I think that most women want a man who's attractive to other women. And so, like, she's kind of playing into that same idea of, if I know that I could lose this person, then
Mm.
do they become more desirable, right? Because they are, you know, they could leave me. And what's really interesting is that when you have it set up that way, you never actually get to feel safe because there's never actually a secure attachment that's formed in that says, I'm in this with you. It just says you can't leave or I could leave at any given moment. So I think there's an attachment wound.
Interesting. There's some kind of paradox in there, like by trying to make something really secure, it's actually doesn't even allow the possibility of true security or and I'm sure there's some parallels in there with like true intimacy as well. Like you're trying to create this thing that is so airtight that it can't breathe.
Right. Yeah. You can choke a relationship to the point where it may still be present, but it is lifeless.
Yeah.
Right. And like, you only really get a true secure attachment when there's enough freedom to be chosen. But that's really scary. And if you go a little bit further, you know, do these people, and I don't know because I'm not their therapist, but do these people believe that somebody would choose them anyway, right? If they didn't have all of these rules in place, if they didn't have
Mm,
the cars, if they didn't have the house, if they didn't have
yeah.
this stuff, you know, do they believe that they would be chosen anyway? And I would venture to guess the answer is no.
Wow. This this brings me back actually to the beginning of part 1 for us, which is to say what you just mentioned these men's therapists as if they have therapists. Uh
We can
because
hope.
we can hope, but I think it brings me back to the question I asked you at the beginning, like what drives some men to find you as a therapist and come see you? How does that happen versus I'm gonna go find this guy who was a steel magnate and now drives a Lamborghini? I kind of recognize as I'm asking the question that there is no answer, but I just think it is maybe what I'm saying is that how different it could be if these men went and got therapy.
Mhm. Well, I can tell you that probably half of my clients probably came because they were at a place in their relationship where either their couples therapist or typically their partner was like, I need you to go and do some individual work, right? The other half, it's because they had a man in their life who had also been to therapy.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And they all chose a woman because it is better to be vulnerable to a woman than it is to be vulnerable with a man. But there's this other thing that it leads into, which is, after we've been working for a while, these guys, they will start to say things to me like, well, but like these feminists, as if I'm not one, right? As if they're not sitting across from a woman with a PhD who is partnered to another woman, right? Who owns her own company. Like it's wild. I mean, sometimes they'll even call me dude. And I'm from New Jersey and I'm a child of the 90s where we called everybody dude. And so like that doesn't even register. But sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I think they stop seeing me as a woman.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Right. Because I mean, they end up valuing what I say.
Oh,
Right.
there's
And
some
I know.
uh,
I can't possibly be a woman if you're valuing what I say. So
but but that but that takes us back actually, if half of them came to you because a woman in their life, they are already in a different category, right? They're already listening to their wives enough to be like, "Okay, yeah, I could do that." Right? Like,
Mhm.
there is already this sense of something is different than like, it's hard to imagine any of the men in this documentary having their female partners be like, "You need to go get therapy," and then being like, "Oh, yeah, okay, I'll go do that."
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
it's impossible to imagine that for me.
Yeah. The one that's really interesting is the second one where other men have said, "Hey, man, like, this
Yes.
was incredible," And then the things that they value are, they value that I looked you up and, like, you seem like you're really nerdy and you, like, read a lot and that kind of stuff. You're a nerd. And so they actually value that, which I think is really interesting, And so it's fascinating. I'm actually really enjoying my work with these guys, but yes, many of them are not. I wouldn't say that any of the men that I'm working with would be featured on this documentary.
Like you've said, self-selecting group.
They are a self-selecting group. I mean, it would be interesting to work with someone from this space. I just don't know if they would stay,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because there's I mean, they have so much to lose, right? Like if they get healthy, what happens? Everything goes away because their entire platform is built on punching down and being a a role model, but also in this way that is grifty and, laden with conspiracy theories and is creating an us them dynamic that
Yeah.
allows for this propaganda machine to keep churning. There is no room for health in that paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose that it also bears mentioning because we haven't really talked about this, and it would feel a little bit irresponsible not to, I think. We've done a lot of talking about like why or how or like, how does this happen? Why do people end up here? What does this look like? Um, and we haven't really talked about the really dark kind of twists and turns, and not that we have to cover in gory detail. All of the horrific things that any one of these men said in the documentary or might be saying, online in some clip. But it does feel like there is some importance in mentioning, like, especially if your listeners are parents of, of boys or of young men or of women or if they are young men or young women and don't know what's out there on the
Mhm.
internet and like being algorithmically fed to, in particular, young men.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanna start with that comes to mind?
I mean, I think, the they would all argue that they love women, uh, but the way that they treat women gives the lie to that, right? Like
Sure.
it is uh, clearly misogynistic, and to the point of, maybe not with the men in the documentary, but like you said, are friends with Andrew Tate, right? Like where there's clear human trafficking and other, sexual assault, rape allegations and convictions. And, I think at the end of the documentary, there was this turn into anti Semitism.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there are other things too.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the anti-Semitism because that was one that, I actually looked up because it was kind of abrupt when it shows up in the documentary, and I ended up looking up, like, what is the through line? Like, why is there such this pipeline between, you know, misogyny, abusive women, and anti-Semitism? And there's this idea of, an enemy of
Mm,
some sort, and there's this idea of, that goes back to these conspiracy theories,
okay.
right? And so I think that that is, when you're looking for an enemy, this is one of the things that, with like nationalism, right? That people are trying to pin their hardships on an enemy because otherwise, like, the angst of just kind of saying life is hard and, like, it it just is, right? Or that the power structures in place, I think, James Talarico, who, has been talking about, like, "Hey, we're focused on the wrong 1% when we talk about who's hurting this country. Like, stop punching down on drag queens and trans people and start looking at the billionaires that are hurting our economy and hurting our culture and that kind of thing." And I think that that is one of the things that happens when you're in this echo chamber of propaganda. You avoid all of the nuance that's designed to bypass critical thinking,
Yeah.
and you get into this slippery slope of oversimplification and normalizing hate speech so that it
Yeah.
doesn't even sound extreme anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's scary.
it really is. I'm glad that you brought that up because it's worth discussing for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not the primary focus of your work here on the podcast or as a therapist, but it just doesn't feel responsible not to mention it.
Yeah,
Right? Like you
well,
could do a whole exposition on. Right, there could be a part 3 on the badness of all of this. But
yeah. No, I think that's really we've had a very nuanced conversation about the parts that we were able to draw nuance out of, and then there's these other pieces that we haven't touched in even 2 episodes because it's just like there's no nuance. It just is horrible, and if you wanna know what I'm talking about, you can go watch the documentary, and you will see plenty of examples of things that we never even touched on because what? Like, what was that? What is that? So, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, for sure. So, well, for everyone who has listened to part 1 and part 2 of this, thanks for hanging in there with us as we went down this deep dive. I love a good deep dive, though. I'm not gonna apologize for that. I think this
you
is
do.
fantastic. So, but thank you so much. Is there any closing thoughts that you have before we sign off?
I mean, maybe I'm just grateful for the people who are doing the work to go in and I don't know, like, I thought that as we were watching the documentary, like, there were some moments where I was like, "Well, this is kinda scary for him."
Mm,
like putting himself in some tense situations. It makes me think of like journalists in combat zones and things like that,
yeah.
where like it is going into potentially violent or dangerous places to learn the truth is uh, that's a pretty noble calling,
Yeah.
and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Me too. Okay, friends. Well, until next time, I hope that you have a beautiful week ahead of you. And again, if you decide that you want to watch this documentary, it's on Netflix. And if you want to tell us about it, please slide into my DMs at the Intimate Philosopher podcast and tell us what you thought of it. And if there's anything that you would like us to talk about on the show, please also send those over because we love making things that are useful to the people who are listening. And that's it. So we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.